Good day, everyone, and a very warm welcome to xSeriCon's latest webinar on topics of process safety management, process hazards analysis, and functional safety interest to the process industry. My name is Peter Clark. I'm the Managing Director of xSeriCon, which is a consultancy specializing in process safety and functional safety. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. Whether you're watching this live or on the recording, we hope that you'll find this interesting and useful, and we look forward to hearing your feedback and questions afterwards. So the topic for today is relating to functional safety assessment. We're going to explain a little bit about what that means. And the major topic is, supposing you have an upcoming functional safety assessment in a project that you're participating in, how best can you prepare for that activity in order to make it as smooth and efficient and productive as possible? At xSeriCon, we do quite a lot of functional safety assessments for other parties. And so we've seen from the sharp end, as it were, how difficult it can be for our clients to prepare and to know what to expect, which often causes quite considerable difficulties and delays in getting the assessment completed. And very often the assessment is coming at a milestone in the project or a gateway whereby completion of the assessment can actually be a milestone for payment or invoicing for our clients. So clearly the pressure is on them to get it finished as quickly and thoroughly as possible. But very often, because of their lack of preparation or their lack of awareness of what's actually involved in FSA, it takes us much longer than they would like. So we want to talk about today how to avoid that situation and make it as smooth as possible. First of all, I'll just say a quick word about who I am. So my name is Peter Clark. I'm the Managing Director of xSeriCon, which is a safety consultancy specializing in process hazard analysis, especially HAZOP, SIL assessment, alarm management, and we also do a lot of functional safety work, the whole functional safety life cycle we can support, and we can also assist with RAM study and safety case preparation as well. I'm going to assume that if you've come on this talk or you're watching this video, that you at least have some idea of what functional safety is and what it means. What we're talking about here is the design, implementation, and management of functional safety systems, which are automatic systems designed to provide protection against specified upset conditions. So, for example, if you're running a chemical process and you've got a vessel that starts to go over pressure or over temperature, you may have an automatic shutdown system that puts it into a safe state when that condition is detected. And that system that provides that automatic protection, an active protection, I should say, we're not talking about passive systems such as pressure relief valves, but if it's an active system that detects and acts positively on the process to put it into a safe state, that is a functional safety system. Now, when we implement functional safety in a process, we generally will follow the relevant IEC standard, which is IEC 61508, is an umbrella standard covering all industries. And then there are standards derived from that for a range of specific industries. In particular, the one that we tend to follow most is IEC 61511, which is the standard for the process industry. And those standards require you to develop a functional safety life cycle, which indicates how you're going to design the functional safety system, how you're going to develop the requirements for it, write a specification for it, and then implement it and manage the life of the system really all the way through from cradle to grave. And part of the management of the system is what I call the assurance activities, which are a range of tasks that you're supposed to do in order to basically prove that everything is working as it should be, especially from the management point of view. Because one of the key focuses of the functional safety standards is to help us to eliminate human errors from the system. And for example, human errors in the design, or in the implementation, or in the testing or maintenance or operation of the system. It could be at any point in the life cycle. And as I said, we have these 4 different activities which we're supposed to do at various points in the life cycle, which are there to help us to prevent and detect and remove errors in the system that could eventually lead to what we call systematic failures of the functional safety system. The four assurance activities that we have are called verification, validation, functional safety audit, and functional safety assessment. And that last one is the one that we're focusing on today. Specifically for functional safety assessment, the standard indicates 5 points in the life cycle where it can be beneficial to perform it. Now, only 2 out of those 5 stages are mandatory, but they're all recommended. And the 5 stages are listed here in the dark blue part at the bottom of the slide you can see now. Risk assessment. So after you complete your initial risk assessment, to measure and quantify the risks that you're trying to protect against using the functional safety system, that is stage 1. And then stage 2 is after you complete the design of the SIS, which stands for Safety Instrumented System, and that's the system that you implement in order to provide the functional safety protection. Stage 3 is after implementation of the SIS. That means after it's been purchased, installed, commissioned, and validated. Then stage 4 is after the system has been in operation with the process running for some time. And then stage 5 is after any modification of the functional safety system. So what is really the purpose of functional safety assessment? We said we've got these 4 methods of trying to detect and remove human errors. So specifically, functional safety assessment is meant to be a high-level assessment that focuses on the systems and procedures that you've put in place to make sure that the functional safety system is able to do its job and achieve its objective throughout the entire life cycle. So it's not really looking at the fine details of exactly what you've done, because the fine details should be getting looked at in other methods, especially the validation and the verification steps. It's more looking at, have you actually got the right systems and processes in place? And have you got the right people in place who can actually implement them and do the work? And do they really know what they're doing? And have any issues that you've found at previous stages actually been cleared up and resolved? So these are some of the things that we would look at, for example, when we're doing functional safety assessment. So, for example, almost the first question we would ask is, have you got a functional safety management plan? Now, the plan is quite an extensive document or set of documents that is required according to the functional safety standards that sets out how you're going to achieve each task that's required by the standards in the functional safety life cycle. And it includes a definition of what life cycle you're actually following and who is responsible for each step and how you're going to confirm that each step was carried out properly. That's the verification. And what input and output documents are required so that you know what is going to be the deliverable, what's going to be the indicator that each step has been successfully completed before you move on to the next one. And then it will also indicate other issues that need to be paid attention to, such as cybersecurity. And there are others that I will mention as we go through the talk today. So that's what we're actually looking at in functional safety assessment. As I say, it's somewhat more on the systems level, looking at processes and procedures rather than drilling down to the fine details. Now, functional safety assessment, you might already be thinking, this sounds like this is quite daunting. It's a big task. Yes, it is. It's a challenging task, most certainly. It's a wide-ranging task. That's certainly true. Is it an expensive task? Well, it doesn't need to be that expensive. And the benefits of FSA can be quite considerable if you do it properly. Now, give you a few examples. So first of all, it may help you to catch issues that have either been missed or have been glossed over, maybe because no one was fully aware of the importance or necessity of paying attention to them. Now, one example is competency management. So the standard says you have to make sure that each person who's been given a task relating to functional safety is competent for that task. And it says a little bit about what we mean by competent in terms of knowledge, training, and experience. And I'd like to give you an example. And it's not a functional safety case, but it is a very serious and important historical accident that was caused by a lack of competency. And that case is the Aberfan disaster, which, although it was a very long time ago, it was in the 1940s in Wales, there was a large spoil heap of mining residue that was allowed to build up near to the pit head in a mining area. And eventually, the spoil heap grew so large and so unstable that it collapsed. And unfortunately, the spoil heap collapsed into a neighboring village and basically destroyed a school where children were at their classes, and more than 100 children were killed in that incident. The Board of Inquiry found that the engineers who were responsible for the maintenance of this and the design of this spoil heap basically were not knowledgeable about the relevant geotechnical issues. They were mechanical engineers rather than geotechnical engineers. So it said that although they couldn't really be blamed, the problem was that they simply were not competent for the task that they'd been given to do. So that should be a reminder to us all that we can never take competency for granted. We can never assume that just because someone has been given a job to do, they actually know how to do it safely. And we must always check and confirm. And that's one issue that we find when we do FSA is very often overlooked. So we pay close attention to that. Another thing is in the green box in the middle of the screen, FSA makes sure that the quality of the work that's done on the functional safety system, especially at the design stage, we need to have some quality assurance on that. And just churning out deliverables, churning out documents doesn't mean that the documents are good enough, that they are correct, they're accurate, and that they're fit for purpose. So we often find that, there's lots and lots of beautiful looking documents, but when you actually look at what's inside, it's actually not good enough to achieve the objectives of functional safety. And then in the blue box at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a concern we often have is about slipping through the cracks. Now, because the scope of work of functional safety is often divided up among many different parties, many different subcontractors and consultants, it's all too easy for issues and responsibilities to get a bit blurred or a bit lost. And we end up with a situation where no one is really taking responsibility for making sure that something has been done completely and correctly. This is a classic problem that is often found in large multi-faceted projects. So this is something that we also pay very close attention to. Is there somebody or some system overseeing all this to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks and nothing disappears? I'm going to show you an example later of a recent project where we've had exactly this problem. Now, who is responsible for executing functional safety assessment? Well, the standard doesn't really specify exactly who can and who can't. It needs to be somebody who obviously knows how to do it. And as it is quite a wide-ranging and in some ways difficult to define task, you can't assume that just anybody can do it. Also, there is an independence requirement in the standard. It's, of course, not reasonable that you should assess your own work because you're much less likely to discover your own mistakes than to discover someone else's mistakes. So usually, therefore, functional safety assessment is given out to a third-party consultant. Such as ourselves. Now, I would like to give you one tip, which I'm going to focus on later, which is if you are a project manager responsible for executing a functional safety project, then please find and select and appoint your functional safety assessor as early as possible in the life cycle. This has numerous advantages, which I'm going to detail a little bit later. Now, when functional safety assessment gets executed, what does it actually look like? Well, I guess I can't speak for others, but the way we do it at xSeriCon is we have a very extensive checklist of points and issues that we're going to look at. And that's developed by ourselves based on the requirements of the standard and based on our own experience of what issues typically come up. And when we go through the checklist, we try to be reasonable about the level of rigor and evidential detail that we expect, because we know that some issues are more important than others. So we will focus heavily on issues that either in our previous experience have caused problems, or issues that if they're overlooked and if there is a problem, it could actually lead to a significant accident in the future. Nonetheless, we do try and go through all the items in our checklist. We also prepare a procedure which explains how we're going to go through it, what kind of evidence we're looking for, and what deliverables we're going to produce, and also what methodology we're going to use for assessing the evidence. Usually, it's good if we can have at some stage fairly early on in the assessment a face-to-face meeting to clarify issues like what is the scope of work, how much of the life cycle are we going to assess, and also if the project is, for example, multiple process units, which of those units are within the scope of work. We need to clarify the lines of communication between the assessor and the other parties. And the main information that we are going to be looking for. What kind of documents do we want? What kind of evidence do we want? Now, for example, for competency, as I've mentioned before, it's very common for the contractor to be unable to provide concrete evidence to us that the competency of the key staff has been checked. So in such cases, we will offer a competency checklist that we have developed, and which it doesn't take very long, but if each key person can go through that checklist and answer each question and provide some supporting evidence, such as some records from previous projects that they've participated in, then that can allow us to sign off on their competency very quickly and easily. So that will be an example of where we will provide a suggested way forward to make everything as smooth as possible. Now, the face-to-face meeting, I must admit, in recent years, because of COVID, has not been feasible. It does make it quite difficult if we cannot at any stage actually meet during the FSA. So we do ask to make that possible, if at all possible. We're going to ask for the documents that in our previous experience are most likely to be the ones that contain the answers we're looking for. So that will be things like the functional safety management plan, the management of change procedure, the competency records, and the deliverables from each relevant life cycle phase. We will then review those documents and the evidence that's been provided in order to try to close out as many of the points in our checklist as possible. Most likely, some points we won't be able to find the evidence, or we may, but there may be some queries about it. So we will then raise a punch list of issues that we need further discussion over. And we can try to deal with those remotely, or we can have another meeting, or we can have Zoom calls or Teams calls to try to resolve all these things. Then at the end, when we've resolved as much as we can, we'll write a final report and review that, and that will go through the client's review process. All right, so what are the top tips then for making FSA as smooth as possible from ourselves as experienced FSA assessors? Well, number one, I already mentioned, if you are the project manager, appoint the assessor as early as possible. Get the procedure, get the checklists, and find out what they're actually expecting. Number two is about verification. We'll talk about that in a minute. Number three is to get the buy-in from other key third parties, and especially the system integrator. Now, by the system integrator, I mean the party that is responsible for developing the application software for your safety instrumented system and executing the factory acceptance test for the logic solver. That organization, whoever it may be, usually they're related to the vendor of the safety instrumented system logic solver, such as Siemens or Emerson or Rockwell, whoever you're using. Usually the system integrator is either that company themselves or another subcontractor that they regularly work with. And those people are absolutely crucial in executing the FSA smoothly. And we often find that this is a sticking point because they are not usually expecting or lined up to be participating in the FSA. Okay, let's focus on tip number one, the assessor. Why is it so important to talk to the assessor as early as possible? Now, a common problem we have is that basically we get ignored. As assessor, we get ignored until it's time to do the assessment. So, and at that point, suddenly everything wakes up. We get sent a massive folder of documents and said, go forth and assess. Now, this is not the way it's supposed to be done. We don't think you'll get much value just by sending a massive stack of evidence to us and telling us to kind of trawl through it, look for a needle in a haystack to find the evidence. That is not effective. For one thing, it takes too long. And for another, it means that we don't have the dialogue that allows us to get to the bottom of the issues and to really add value to your project. Because we're not here just to tick a box and say everything is okay. We're here to add value to the project and to help you resolve the underlying issues, whatever they may be. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we supply the procedure, which, of course, like every procedure that's part of the project, it should be approved and signed off by the project owner. Now, this very often doesn't happen, but it should, because it's a key part of the assuring the safety of the final project. So it must be signed off, and rarely is. So get the procedure early, get it approved, and then follow it, which tells you what preparation needs to be done. That's the procedure. And then another thing is to get hold of the checklists. Now, the checklist will show you what questions are going to be asked and what kind of documents we're looking for, what are our expectations as an assessor, and also shows you the scope of what we're going to look at. Now, another thing you can do is ask us as an assessor what we're actually expecting. So, for example, when you look at our checklist, you'll see, has the competency of the key personnel been assured? And you may say, well, how do I know what you will accept as evidence for that? Well, the answer is ask us for a sample, and we'll show you a sample from a previous assessment, or ask us for the competency checklist. I keep on going back to the example of competency because that is the case where we most often see problems. But there are plenty of other examples as well of where the client doesn't really know what we are expecting, and all they need to do is ask, and we will tell them. We'll give examples to show very clearly what we hope to see as clear evidence that the issue has been properly addressed. On to tip number 2 about verification. Well, first of all, what is verification? Well, remember earlier I mentioned that there are 4 different assurance activities that should be part of the functional safety life cycle: verification, validation, functional safety audit, and functional safety assessment. So verification is one of the others. And verification is a step-by-step task that you do at the end of each phase of the life cycle to confirm that the life cycle phase has been completely and correctly executed, and that the outputs from it are correct and are what you need to proceed on to the next step. So it should be a very detailed drill down into all the fine details of exactly what's been done in each phase. And I really can't stress enough how important verification is as an assurance tool, but also it's terribly neglected. We very rarely see a project where verification is planned or executed at anywhere near the required level of depth. And it's not really that difficult if you plan it in right from the beginning. We will happily provide you with examples and tips of how to do verification in an efficient and thorough way. Which phases of the life cycle does verification apply to? Basically, every phase that generates some kind of output, and you can see a list of the relevant phases on your screen now: HAZOP, SIL assessment, safety requirement specification development, and so on. Who is responsible for verification? Well, you can assign anybody you want to. That's defined in the functional safety management plan. It just needs to be somebody who can understand the work that was done during the phase, and of course not the same person who actually did the work, because again, you really can't verify your own work. And when should it be done? Well, this is really important. It must be done immediately after the work is completed. Now, one very common problem we find is that verification is left until we as functional safety assessors ask for it. And that's far too late. You lose all the benefit of doing it if you leave it so late, because the whole point of verification is to make sure each step is complete before moving to the next step. If you wait till later, then any issues that you find in verification, and if you do it properly, then you almost certainly will find issues. It means you then have to backtrack through all the other steps that happened in between and find out whether those issues have any impact on those steps. So it's really a must to do verification immediately after the applicable step. Let me give you an example of how verification can be done. So here's a little bit of a checklist. Now, this particular checklist actually goes on for several pages, so you're just seeing the very beginning part of it here. This is a checklist for the SIL assessment phase. And you can see, first of all, it looks at, was the correct and complete scope of work executed during the SIL assessment? Did it involve a workshop? Were all the relevant people participating in the workshop? And then moving on to the next section, was there a properly defined procedure? Did it define the scope of work? Was the procedure approved? Was the correct revision of the procedure actually used to execute the SIL assessment? And so on and so on. this particular checklist is actually provided in a forthcoming textbook that xSeriCon is about to publish, called Functional Safety from Scratch. It's going to be published by Elsevier in next March. So if you want to see the complete checklist, you can get the book, or actually just ask us and we will share what we can to help you get started. Now, why is it so important? Why am I stressing this point so heavily, that verification is a must before FSA? Well, one of the things we're going to look at in FSA is we're looking at the functional safety life cycle as a whole. And in order to do that, we need to have confidence that you completed each step properly before moving on to the next. And the way we do that is to look at the verification and say, did you actually verify? For example, did you verify your SIL assessment before using that to generate the safety requirement specification and the basic design of the SIS? If that verification is not there, then how can we know whether the SIL assessment was actually complete, whether it was actually done properly? The only way we could do it as FSA assessors is basically to do the verification all over again for you. And that would be extremely time consuming and costly, and very, very inefficient. So that's why, one of the reasons why you need to get the verification completed before you move on to the functional safety assessment. And it also helps, again, this issue about falling through the cracks, that if you've made sure that you've got a proper verification of each life cycle phase, then it ensures that somebody is responsible for that verification. And this is another common problem we've found, is that the responsibility for the verification is often quite unclear. Okay, moving on to tip number 3. The other parties that need to participate in FSA, they need to be lined up. They need to have it written into their contract, their scope of work, basically, that they must participate fully in the FSA and cooperate with the assessor in getting all the necessary evidence and answering the questions. And this all too often doesn't happen. Now, I'm going to focus specifically on the system integrator because this is where we tend to see the biggest problems. And the problems are biggest because the role of the system integrator is bigger than any other party who might be involved, apart from maybe the consultant who does the HAZOP and SIL assessment. They also have a very big role. But once their job is done, then the next big outside party is typically the system integrator. Now, the system integrator is usually very familiar with doing projects of this nature, and they have their own internal systems and processes and their own documents and procedures, which frankly are extremely difficult for anyone else to understand. So while they may produce all of these nice and very long looking documents, like their for example, their functional analysis and their SIS specification, they are so hard for anyone outside their own organization to understand that we as assessors, basically coming into the project from outside, we usually have no chance of confirming that that they've done their job properly. Also, another problem is we often find that their documents are generic. They don't customize them sufficiently for each individual project. So often, for example, we'll be looking at a document, a specification, trying to see whether you've set up, for example, diagnostic alarms properly. By which I mean, if something goes wrong with the logic solver or with one of the, for example, the smart transmitters that's part of the safety instrumented system, it can make the logic solver take a specified action. For example, it can raise an alarm, or it can even trip immediately if that is appropriate in terms of the what is needed to put the process into a safe state. So that behavior needs to be defined. And it needs to be specified that this is what the system is actually going to do. Now, very often when we open up the specification provided by the system integrator, we'll see a statement such as, you could do this, or you may do that, or here are your options for what to do when a diagnostic fault is, or when a fault is detected by diagnostics. But it doesn't say what the system actually will do. It just says, what are the options? And that's not enough. It's too generic. We need to know what has been specified for this project and what has been implemented for this project. That's just one of many, many examples I could give you about problems that we have with documentation from the system integrator. Another problem is the system integrator doesn't often seem to be expecting to be asked all these questions. It seems sometimes that they expect their work to be treated like a black box, where you just give them the requirement, you give them, for example, the cause and effect diagram and say, there you go, off you go, and write the application software and do the FAT and send us the report. And at the end, that's fine. No further questions. Well, that doesn't work from the functional safety assessment point of view. We cannot treat anything as a black box. We have to be able to verify that everybody, no matter how experienced they are, no matter how many times they've done it before and how many projects they've done before, we must be able to confirm that it's correct in every detail for this project. So the system integrator needs to be aware that we are going to go into a considerable level of depth, and they need to provide the resources to respond to that level of analysis from us. So a couple of examples that we've faced in recent projects. Factory acceptance test. Of course, we as assessors do not witness the factory acceptance test. So the only thing we can do is to look at the report afterwards. Now, we found that the report was very generic, very opaque, a lot of abbreviations, a lot of information that we simply could not find anywhere in the report. For example, we never found any evidence, this is from one particular project we did recently, that the voting on the 2 out of 3 sensors had actually been tested. No one had confirmed that, as far as we could see, that if you activate one sensor, it doesn't trip, but if you activate any 2 or all 3 sensors, it does trip. We couldn't find any evidence that that had been tested in the FAT. And that was just one of several examples. So we asked, okay, who can explain this report to us to help us to find this evidence? Silence. Nobody could. Nobody actually understood the report, at least nobody that would talk to us, because the report had already been completed by another party several months ago. That party was now signed off, finished, with no further responsibility for the project. So they weren't willing to get involved. Big problem for us. Another example, management of change procedure. Now, the management of change procedure is typically owned by the facility owner, not by the EPC contractor, which means that if we have questions or doubts about the MOC procedure, about its suitability, we have to go to the owner, and the owner is usually, again, expecting us to do everything at a distance, and they are not expecting to get involved. Also, they're usually not willing to change their documents when we find issues with them, because they say, oh, that's owned by global HSE group and we can't change it. So we then have a problem. We say your MOC procedure is insufficient, it's not fit for purpose. So you need to update it. Otherwise, we can't pass the FSA. So we kind of hit a problem. And one typical example of where the MOC procedure is often inadequate is in functional safety, the performance of the functional safety system needs to be reviewed not only when the system itself is going to be changed, but also when the risks that the system is protecting against are going to be changed. So to give you one example, changes of manning level. I'll give you a specific example. We worked on a project a few years ago, where it was an offshore platform that was originally designed as to be normally not manned, normally unmanned. But then during the first few years of operation, the owner found that actually it was not practical. You needed somebody on site most of the time. So they changed it from unmanned operation to manned operation. Now, that obviously changes the level of risk quite considerably, because it means that if you have a major incident that could lead to a fire or explosion, you're now looking at the potential for operator injury, or a much higher likelihood of operator injury than you were originally. And that means that the risk levels have all changed. So that change from unmanned to manned should have triggered a review of the functional safety life cycle. And that trigger should have been written into the management of change procedure. But rarely is that the case. Usually the management of change procedures, it just says, if you're going to change the equipment, then you follow MOC. But what we're saying is, no, you need to follow the MOC if you are changing the risk level. And some other examples on your screen: changes of feedstock can change the risk level, and changes in other layers of protection, for example, alarm systems, relief valves, even the equipment starting to age can make a difference to the risk level. So the MOC must specify that those changes should require a review of the functional safety requirements for the project, and that's often not the case. So that's the kind of thing that we will pick up during FSA. Another example that we've found recently, we were working on a big project which had two different contractors. One contractor was responsible for detailed design, and then at the end of detailed design, their part was signed off, and the whole project was handed over to another contractor, which was going to do the actual construction and commissioning. And we were responsible for the stage 2 functional safety assessment, which is reviewing the detailed design. But the problem is that they only called us in to do this after the sign-off had already been done for contractor A, which means that the issues we found, and we did find a lot of issues with the design, contractor B said, well, that's not our responsibility. We're not responsible for design. And contractor A said, well, we've signed off already. We've got the owner has approved our design, so we're not changing it. So we were stuck. Now we've got an FSA that had numerous quite serious open issues, and nobody willing to actually resolve them. So that's yet another example of why you should get your assessor involved as early as possible, and don't leave FSA to the last, or in this case, till after the last minute. Okay, I said I was going to give you 3 tips, but I'm generous. So here comes your bonus tip for today, which is action items. Now, another problem that we often find is lack of evidence for a proper procedure to ensure that action items are getting closed out. Now, what kind of action items are we talking about? Well, for example, recommendations from HAZOP, actions from SIL assessment, issues discovered during verification, actions raised or follow-up issues raised during previous functional safety assessment stages, issues discovered during SIL verification. So, for example, supposing you're doing your SIL verification and you find that some of your safety instrumented functions do not meet their risk reduction target. At some point, that issue has to be resolved. And I think those issues should be put into the action items tracking system to make sure that they do get closed out. Because time and again, we found SIL verification report that we see for FSA shows open issues, and there's no evidence, no trail of evidence that they've actually been addressed, that they resulted in design changes. And another issue that sometimes results in action items is the cybersecurity assessment. So we need to see, excuse me, one moment, get a sip of water. So we need to see evidence of two things. One, are you actually closing your action items? And number two, have you got a procedure to make sure they get closed? Actually, we're more interested in the procedure, because the closing of the items themselves, that really will be assessed during the functional safety audit, which usually comes around about the same time as the FSA, either before or after. After is probably better. So yeah, we want to see your procedure for closure of action items, and this is often a gap that we find, that there's nothing there in place to make sure that all these issues are actually getting tracked. Well, that's all I wanted to say for today. Thank you very much if you've followed us all the way through to this point, and I hope that talk has been useful and interesting for you. If you want any further guidance or tips about functional safety assessment or anything else relating to the functional safety life cycle, please feel free to drop us an email, or you can unmute your mic and ask us a question now. Also, we'd like to know what other webinar topics you would find interesting. Our next webinar on Thursday, the 12th of January, will be on the subject of FMEA, and that is a topic that was requested by one of the participants in a previous webinar in this series. So we do pay attention, and if we can, we will do a webinar on the subjects that you request, if it's within our expertise. If you are responsible for executing functional safety assessment, we'd like to let you know that we are going to be launching some FSA support software very soon. We found one problem with doing FSA ourselves is that there is so much information flying back and forth, and documents and query lists and action items, and it's very easy to drown in a sea of information. So we have developed software to help us do this, and we will offer you a free trial of that software, and if you like it, you can license it from us. So let us know, and we'll keep you in touch as soon as that trial is available. And we also have SIL verification software, which has been on the market for a couple of years now. Much loved by those who use it. It's very smooth, very comfortable, very powerful software. So ask for a free trial, and we'll send you a free 7-day license for that software. And if you want any other information about our consultancy or our training, we do offer a lot of different training resources, including some distance learning packages that you can use for training by yourself, or online classroom training we do as well. Then please see our website, which is just www.xSeriCon.world, and anything of interest that you find there, just drop us a message, and we'll see what we can do to help you. Well, that's all for today. I'm going to close now. If you have a question, please feel free to ask now. Otherwise, I will close for today. I will say thank you very much for your participation, and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar on the 12th of January.